Richard, I've been bombarded with all different kinds of concepts of God, which differ from the traditional Judeo-Christian Islamic monotheism. I'd like to throw some of them at you and see how they sound. First is pantheism, that God in the universe is one. And it's a real kind of God. It's not like dismissing the word God or using the word God in an artificial way, but everything in reality and God are the same.
Well, that wouldn't make God a very simple being, would it? That is to say, there would be a large number of parts of God, and one would wonder how these are related to each other. And since things behave in the universe, in different parts of the universe, in the same way, one would suppose the simplest explanation of that would be in terms of something outside them controlling how they behave in the same way. For example, if something falls at the same rate from a tower to the ground in Australia as it does in England, one would suppose this isn't just a coincidence, but it depends on something outside these particular falls. So the moment you postulate God as an extended being, the question arises as to what is the source of the unity of that extended being. And if it's, well, just how it is, an accident, then all principles of rationality say you mustn't say that what would otherwise be vast coincidences are just how it happens. You look for an explanation of this, and that takes you outside the world of bits, which is what extended things consist of. So I think it just leaves the things that God is supposed to explain, is the universe, as they're unexplained, and that is a very complicated supposition to suppose that many bits coincidentally behave in the same way. And all the principles of rationality say you should look for simple explanations of complex phenomena, and simple explanations are more likely to be true. And the traditional God is a God who is not extended in space, and therefore these problems don't arise.
The next move is taking God and making God a superset of pantheism, and it's called panentheism. So where everything that exists in the universe is part of God, but yet God is bigger than that and has a transcendence, but also that unity.
Yes, but, and of course, part of what you say is traditional, that is to say, the world, the physical world, God determines, God causes it, causes most things in it, and knows about things in it. As Aquinas says, he is present everywhere by his causation and by his knowledge. But if you are in then, as the way you describe it, the natural description would fit that the physical world is God's body, as it were, but God is something bigger than that. But saying that it's his body suggests that he's tied down to it. He can't get rid of it. I mean, our bodies are things that cause us trouble from time to time, and we can't slough them off and suddenly adopt another body. But the traditional theistic view says, yes, the world is controlled by God, he's present at it, and if that's what you mean, all you mean by panentheism, then it's traditional theism. But if you want to say, well, God can't help having a world, and he's tied down to it, and his actions are in part determined by it, and he can't get rid of it, then that's certainly not traditional theism. And then the same problem arises as with pantheism, viz. There are an awful lot of things going on which, as it were, God can't help going on, and therefore there's not a final explanation of why those things are going on, because, well, they're part of God, and if they're part of God, then they're part of the ultimate explanation thing which doesn't have an explanation. So unless you postulate a God who is outside the world, you're left with the large number of coincidences which are constituted by the regular behavior of things in the world.
there are a number of approaches to the Judeo-Christian God that seek to harmonize that God with the scientific world.
Yes.
These are expressed in Christian naturalism, eliminating miracles or the soul. It's expressed in a Christianity where God is not a person, a whole series of things that seek this, reconciliation.
Yes, and I would have a different comment on each of them. Yes, of course, I am very keen on the idea that Christianity should give or any religion should give take account of anything that science has discovered. I very much favor that. But it doesn't seem to me that science has discovered that anything that is contrary to a traditional view of God. Now, you mentioned, for example, the view that we ought to think of humans just as physical objects, and we mustn't think of them as souls which have special access to God. Well, I think there are strong arguments in favor of the existence of souls, and in particular, there's a truth about whether some future person is me or isn't me. But if this truth was simply a matter of how many bits of the previous body that subsequent person has, then the natural thing to say is, well, to the extent to which that person is me, has enough bits of my body, that person is me. And that would suggest being me is a matter of degree and so on. But clearly it isn't, because clearly either that person, I am going to have the experiences of that person, or I am not. I'm not going to have partly the experiences of that person. So there must be something that makes the future person me. And that can only be if what makes the future person me is not a physical part, because any physical part can be replaced, and the subsequent person couldn't be fully me. But it's a truth about whether I'm going to have some experience tomorrow or not, and that can only be if what makes me me is not a divisible thing. That's one form. I think we've discussed remind me of the other forms you think that this view takes.
The other part is that God is not a person.
Yes. The traditional arguments to the existence of God are arguments to a personal being, because they are arguments from the universe having certain features that an agent who was interested in producing good things would produce. That is to say, it's not a chaotic mess, they're all things that serve a purpose. They are all aimed at a good. It's good for there to be humans who make choices between things, and they can only make choices between things if the world is a regular place. I can only choose whether to hurt you or harm you. If I know that by sticking a dagger into you, I will harm you, or by giving you food, I will benefit you. But this means that the world must be regular. That is to say that when you stick daggers into people, they hurt, and when you give them food, they stay alive. The world must be a regular place in which me doing something will have this effect, me doing something else will have that effect. And so, if God is interested in producing creatures who can make a contribution to improving themselves, improving the world, improving each other, or alternatively choose to damage these things, and it's good that there should be other beings who can make these choices and make these differences, then he would make a world of our sort. And so the arguments to the existence of God are the arguments to an agent who sees something as good to make and makes it for that reason. And that is reason to believe that the source of the universe is a personal source.
There's a whole series of alternative concepts of God that deal with the development of God, that God is a being that changes and improves. Developmental theism, one is called. Process theology is a whole area where God has a sequence of different states in a positive direction.
Well, the trouble with that is one immediately asks the question of why it is that there is this development. What determines that the development of, quote, God, close quote, is in a certain direction rather than another direction? And the people who put forward this theory have a view that, as it were, there is a form of progress in God, and there's a natural direction for God to move into, and then, but in that case, this is something that itself needs an explanation. Why is it that the world is so made that God develops? And to be able to posit this question presupposes that there's an answer to it in something outside the series of developments. I mean, it's said to be a good thing that, quote, God should develop in this way. Okay. Well, in that case, we're looking for an agent who sees that it's a good thing and helps God to develop in that way. But in that case, of course, what we are saying is that a God of this development sort is not going to be the ultimate explanation of the universe, because there's everything about him, his imperfection and change, but regularity, which calls for explanation from outside. So we move from a developmental God to a non-developmental God.
One whole view that may or may not have a God in it is the concept that the ultimate reality of reality is value, or the good, a Platonic good, that there's a value in reality, and that itself is causative, and indeed may have brought God into existence, and God may be the creator and everything that we think, but underlying all of it is the value of good.
This is the idea that there is a law bringing forth good things. Well, we are and this is posited as an explanation of why there is a universe. Well, it's a pattern of explanation of which there is absolutely no other instance. That is to say, we are familiar with two kinds of explanation of phenomena in the world. First, in terms of scientific laws, which regularly produce certain effects from certain causes, and secondly, in terms of human beings who do things because they seek to achieve some goal, and they have some purpose in achieving this. And we explain different phenomena, different mundane phenomena, either by the inanimate processes or by the purposes of agents who have limited powers and bring goals about. Now, the traditional theism is an explanation of the second sort. That is to say, we bring about limited effects for limited goals. God brings about the universe also for a purpose, to make it a suitable home for us, and no doubt for other purposes as well. So it's an agent bringing about an effect in virtue of his powers and his beliefs about how to do so. So it's a familiar sort of explanation, and we recognize it as a way of explaining things. But the theory which you mentioned, the axiarchic theory, there is absolutely no other instance of a law producing an effect without, as it were, operate a scientific law, the law of gravity, and it produces an effect because there's a previous state of affairs on which it acts to produce this effect. When I drop it, the law of drop a ball, the law of gravity, as it were, takes over and makes the ball fall to the ground, but there's a previous state of affairs. The law doesn't operate independent of the world. Now, this is a suggestion there's a law a law which operates for the sake of the good, but which has nothing to do with personal explanation. So why should we call it an explanation at all if it is something we can't recognize as bringing about effects? Furthermore, we see no other instance of anything, not merely bring nothing at all, but no other instance of things happening on a small scale for the sake of the good. That is to say, the dinner doesn't arrive on the table just because it's good that it should do so. Somebody has to bring it there. And on the other hand, this is a suggestion that uniquely the universe as a whole is being produced because it's good. There's no other instance of anything like that at all. So why the fact that there's nothing at all like it suggests that inductively it's most unlikely that anything like that should be happening, whereas it's very likely that persons or scientific laws should be operating in other fields because we've seen them operating in this field. That's one point to make. The second point to make is this. If the being there is a lot of pain and suffering in the world, and any theism or substitute for theism, which says that the good is being produced, has got to explain why there is this. Now, theism has a theodicy. It says that we are allowed to do good. It's good that we should have a choice between good and evil, and that is why often there is evil. And of course, you may say that, well, can't an axiarchic theory also explain the existence of pain and suffering in this way? But the point is that there are, or rather 2 points, there are certain sorts of things in the world which would only be good if there is a God of the personal kind. For example, religious experience apparently of God will only be good if there is a God, or alternatively, the kinds of worship which people are encouraged to pursue would only be good if there's a God. Otherwise, it would be very bad that people should have this. But also, there is a lot of pain and suffering, and if a person makes other people suffer for a good cause, there comes a time when that person has to suffer with them. The view that there is a law which just produces the good, and that is the basic law of the universe, runs into the problem that the only kinds of way we explain other things in the universe are very different from that. We explain many things by the actions of persons. I bring about the cup being on the table because I put it there for a purpose. We explain things in terms of the operation of scientific laws. The cup broke because it fell from the table, and there are certain laws of gravity which have the consequence that if you drop breakable things that are to a hard floor, they will break. So we can explain things in terms of scientific explanation of laws of nature acting on initial conditions. We can explain things by the actions of persons who act for purposes. Traditional theism is an explanation of the world in terms of a personal being who brings about an effect in virtue of his powers, in virtue of his beliefs, and in virtue of his purposes. But here we have a suggestion of a kind of explanation for which there is no parallel at all apart from this instance of it. So there's every reason to suppose that there isn't very good evidence for it. That is to say, the fact that there are successful explanations in terms of purposes or scientific laws makes it reasonable to expect there will be another explanation in terms of those things. But there is no parallel and therefore no reason to expect that kind of explanation of things. Furthermore, if it was, so there is no parallel also for things popping into existence just because it's good, they should pop into existence. The dinner doesn't arrive on the table just because it's good, somebody has to put it there. But the suggestion is that this unique case, the universe itself, it comes about and everything in it because it's good. Now, the trouble is the universe has a lot of pain and suffering in it, so you need a theodicy to explain why there's evil. And the explanation is that certain evils serve a necessary good. We can only have significant choices. If it's possible, we bring about evil and so on. But there is rather a lot of suffering and pain in the world. And if a being, God, understood in the traditional sense, brings about that, then even for a good cause, he ought to suffer with us. If somebody makes a child suffer for a good cause, then the father who makes the child suffer ought to share his suffering to some extent. Okay, but if that happens, then, as it were, that to some extent justifies if I impose suffering on you, but because I think it's such a good thing, I suffer with you, that to some extent justifies, not fully, but is an additional justification for me causing your suffering. And therefore our suffering is, as it were, less of a bad thing if God suffers with us. It still requires an explanation of why, of the purposes it serves. But still, it's not as bad if God, who makes us suffer, suffers with us, as it would be if we suffered on our own. Now, if it's an inanimate law that causes our suffering, the possibility doesn't arise because the inanimate law cannot suffer with us. And therefore, the problem of evil is more of a problem for this sort of explanation than it is for traditional theism.